Thank you, Akash, very much, and thank you for the kind introduction. It was a bit long, I thought, but it's always a pleasure to be back here in JNU. I've been here as a student at the Zakir Hussain Center, and I was here for a short time at the faculty as well. The vibrance of JNU stays with me, even though the place doesn't look like what it was. So I hope that we have enough time. Since we started very late, do we have the same hour? Okay, that's allocated for this session. There's a lot to share, of course, but I will try and put my thoughts in some kind of a coherent manner so that we can actually look at the possibilities of what the real issues are with regard to social science learning, and specifically at the school level. I do understand that there is, I'm not a historian, so I come from a background of education after having done psychology honors and MA in psychology, but I studied education at the research level. And I think it's very important for all young people to look at education also as a site when they're studying history or sciences or economics or any other subject, because the kind of edifice we have of education has a very, very deep impact on how we proceed, and not just higher education, but what we've gone through. So some of the talking points I have today are with regard to looking at the historical overview of social sciences in India, largely post-independence, but a little bit before that. Curriculum also, because I think it's important to locate the social sciences in the larger frame of curriculum and its contemporary directions. The nature of social sciences in schools, social science in independent India, the textbooks and the curriculum frameworks from the time we started with 1975, first curriculum framework, and also to look at the major debates within the social sciences in school social science, which are with regard to social science or social studies, question of values, and of course ideas of critical pedagogy, teacher agency, student agency, and textbooks, the major debates, etc., around these issues. Quickly, for a historical overview, are we okay with English, or do I need to break into Hindi? English is okay, fine. So the development of the social sciences from, let's say, 18th century Enlightenment continued with industrialization and the rise of the nation states. These were institutionalized in the late 19th century, developed under the shadow of so-called Newtonian physics. So social science really had that burden to bear for a long time. They emerged, of course, to unite what is called the search for truth, and which the sciences still claim is their stronghold, and search for goodness. But it wasn't that social sciences were able to do the unification, because I think they were torn apart because of the dissonance between the two. And yet they were therefore not able to develop true autonomy for a long time as an area of knowledge. And even today, there are people who question us and tell us what is social about social science and what is science about social science. So the 20th century, of course, saw a remarkable growth in social sciences, both in terms of theory and methodology. But Wallerstein remarked very interestingly in the late 1990s that social sciences as they exist, and they were very Eurocentric at that time, were really of the civilized world, by the civilized world, and about the civilized world. And I think a separate social science was seen in anthropology, which was looked to be a study that will look at primitive cultures. And the third kind, the so-called non-Western, were the Orientalists. And there we know the various debates around that coming from so-called high civilizations like India and China. These kind of tensions between different social sciences continue to exist even today, and of course we have a whole new emergence of subaltern social sciences that have impacted many post-colonial societies as we made an attempt to decolonize our knowledges and knowledge systems. But we need to look at this in the context of the larger curriculum frame within India. So we find that in India we had the 19th century colonial project, all of you are very familiar with that, and the 20th century counter movement, which is the anti-colonial, where of course the whole idea was to do away with the modernist, individualistic, behaviorist, positivist kind of model that actually was rooted in the early 1900s, which is really early 20th century. And it was seen as curriculum that is objectively constructed. There are general principles around construction of curriculum, and context was absolutely not important. And there was an anthropocentric view where, of course, we also had a reverence for the Cartesian understanding of the nature-culture dualism. And I think in some senses we continue to suffer that. But there was a curriculum for a free India that was being imagined, whether it was Gandhi, Tagore, Sri Aurobindo, and of course Ambedkar nobody talks about, but not that he's delved straight into curriculum, but the point is that there was a complete disconnect in terms of the epistemic link between the anti-colonial discourse, which was coming from the freedom struggle and the nationalist leaders, largely led by the Indian National Congress, and the anti-caste discourse and movements that was being led by Ambedkar, was of course drawing inspiration from 50 or more than half a century ago, whether it was Phule and whether it was Kabir and Buddha. Although we can say that curriculum in the Nai Talim idea of Gandhi's Nai Talim was an act of deliberation, because it was not as if curriculum should be based on general principles, but it should be an act of deliberation, because there is no such thing as an intrinsic view of knowledge that we need to follow, because that leads us to a universalistic frame that is very colonial in its approach. Tagore, of course, brought more integration with modern education as well, and he spoke, like Gandhi and others, of liberating oneself and the other. Now, curriculum in Free India was actually going against the individual towards the collective aim of human life, towards liberating everyone. It was also the counter narratives to the colonial view were also trying to develop an integrated people who had a scientific outlook, a rational mind, which comes from some kind of modern education, but also self-reliance economically, socially, psychologically. This vision of education, of course, was a critique of the narrow individualistic aims, but we have adopted the colonial system after independence by default, because upper caste leaders, nationalist leaders paid very little attention to Ambedkar's ideas that underlined the Indian Republic in 1950, which is the dissonance between being politically democratic with one vote, one value, but socially not having that. And this struggle is now playing out right in front of us today, the dissonance between social and political democracy. So the modern system of education was adopted by independent India, where the society was steeped in hierarchy and power. So the attempts to bring education closer to people by way of culture, by way of languages, was frustrated in the early post-colonial period, and it did not allow any genuine engagement with questions of caste-based structural hierarchies and inequalities. And I think the project of coloniality continued long after the British left. The colonial epistemic frame actually was individual rather than social, and the link between quality and privilege contributed to shaping our education, specifically at the school level, something that J.P. Naik warned us of in 1975. Hence, the conception of curriculum that was given a much wider meaning in the Indian context was reduced to a set of textbooks that were to be transmitted in classrooms. And the curriculum for preparing school teachers, which actually comes from the legacy of normal schools that was set up during the colonial rule, let me tell you, until 2015, this system we could not move. It's only in 2015 that the one-year B.Ed became a two-year B.Ed, thanks to the Supreme Court constituted Justice Verma Commission, of which I was a member. It's a long story of struggle, but we don't ever say that we have achieved a lot, because the two-year can do more of the same. So we are still very skeptical in terms of what is happening. But school education remained insular despite the decolonization of knowledge that was happening in the higher education institutes of India. We can say with some pride, history, political science, sociology, some of the key social sciences actually were able to decolonize the way we thought about these ideas and disciplines. But curricular ideas that were rooted in the nationalist and the anti-caste discourse threw up issues of alienating curriculum because of language, because of content, and completely dismissing concerns of equity, social justice, inner resilience, and social responsibility. These were outside the colonial frames, and India's school education system continued this colonial frame. Higher education, of course, became the site of decolonized knowledge. But it is only with the NCF 2005 that this knowledge produced within higher education actually came down into school textbooks, and we had cutting-edge textbooks post NCF 2005. The world recognized them. Today we can't recognize them anymore. From their beginnings, the social sciences social sciences have been Eurocentric. We know after the Second World War there was a linear, homogeneous approach that was offered to understanding social life right across the world. An interest in local forms, of course, and rootedness of knowledge in social life came slowly with post-colonial, post-modernist researchers. We do know that the nature of social sciences had to struggle in terms of developing its own scientific identity, its methodologies, quantitative, qualitative, but the interpretivist and the later postmodernist, constructivist, culturalist schools of thought would disagree with such claims. And social and historical phenomena, which is actually embedded in context, is what is the heart of social sciences. Unfortunately, in any given culture, we don't seem to recognize that when we are developing curriculum, because the epistemological plurality of social sciences is something that is non-deterministic, but we are not able to accept that as scientific enough, and that continues to be a struggle. A paradox of the social sciences, especially in schools, is that it failed to occupy a central place. So that today, in 2023 NCF, we have a very clear statement that history is not to be taught as history. It's part of an interdisciplinary study of social sciences right up to the secondary level. They speak of history as a separate discipline only at the +2 level. Traditionally, we've had history, geography, civics that has been taught, but social sciences have always been part of higher education. In the post-colonial context of India, there was a need for social sciences because it was perceived to be something that will help us develop our nation, or nation building, so to speak, and modernization. Because nation building and modernization was actually synonymous for the Kothari Commission. And the genesis and purpose of social science in India can be traced to the 1954 UNESCO Roundtable that happened on the teaching of social sciences in South Asia in 1954, where Dr. Radhakrishnan argued that both the natural and the social sciences give us instruments and not norms for the right use of those instruments. Sciences, natural or social, give us knowledge, not judgment. Power, not vision, strength, not sanction. But unfortunately, the instrumental idea of social sciences actually took root rather than it being a knowledge to be regularly sort of discovered, invented, understood as society unfolds, evolves, etc. So it was very tough for us to even challenge that, because it came from the European understanding of the nation and the nation state. So we had to follow the same path of developing a nation, a unified nation, and the idea of civic education, which was the heart of social science, was to develop conforming, obedient citizens. In independent India, of course, there was also the possibility of looking at social studies only for citizenship education and a contribution to a social attitude, so to speak. But if you look at the social science textbooks, how they evolved, it was really rooted in the formulation of NCERT. In 1961, interestingly, it started in CIE itself, which was a post-independence institute as old as the country. The NCERT started there in 61 but has become much bigger, so it moved out. And in its early years, NCERT conducted a study on the position of social sciences in India. And there were 4 All India workshops held in 64. A syllabus was developed from class 1 to class 11. The theme of citizenship education became characteristic. And we found that happening in the first curriculum document of 1975 through to 2005. But when we look at these documents carefully with a magnifying glass, that is when we realize that there are finer nuances and some radical interpretations of this curricular aim. The first curriculum framework that was 1975, proposed in post-independence India, and I'm quoting, aspires to enable the growing children of tomorrow to participate in the affairs of the community, the state, the country, and the world at large through the teaching of social sciences. Professor Romila Thapar was part of the 1975 Curricular Framework Committee. Social sciences in the NCF 1988, for example, was seen as the creation of a citizenry conscious of their rights and duties. So duties also come in now, committed to the principles embodied in our constitution. At least that was there. This was post-1986 policy, which we also critique, because that was the precursor to the neoliberal age which impacted education. But later in 2000 NCF, we found under the new political regime, which has come back with a thumping majority and continues to threaten us as an India that we dreamt and lived in, it redefined citizenship education in terms of an explicit emphasis on content essential to nurture national identity and a sense of pride. Now, this was in sharp contrast to the 1975 NCF, which had envisioned schools that could ensure, and it is written there, I'm quoting, narrow, parochial, chauvinistic, obscurantist tendencies are not allowed to grow. I mean, we had to write this clearly in our curriculum framework in 75, and instructions in social sciences were to promote values, promote ideals of humanism, secularism, socialism, and democracy for a just order. So it's talking of a socially just world order, in fact. The 88 NCF tried to go along this to locate social science as the overall aim of education as a powerful instrument, but for human resource development. So we had already started commodifying the idea of education and people who are educated. NCF 2005 articulates a more radical aim for the teaching of social sciences. The critical significance of social science in the NCF is to develop a just and peaceful society, but it talks of establishing social inquiry as a scientific endeavor that must challenge patriarchal frames of inquiry. And this is the first time that we find a school curriculum saying that social science is not just a subject to be taught in schools. It is an overarching foundational subject discipline area of study for locating education itself, the arrangements of education, the approach and the curriculum and so on. And of course it talks of developing critical, interrogative, transformative citizens. Now, knowing that social and historical phenomena are embedded in context, what makes up the social sciences? The social science curriculum has attempted to include history, geography, political science, economics, but we find that this happened only with NCF 2005, where sociology, anthropology, psychology also were brought in, where the thrust on history was both method and content. History curriculum was viewed like that. It was meant to be an interpretive tools of analysis that we give to our students. The history curriculum aims to see patterns of the past through the eyes of ordinary people, to understand events and social processes that have causes and consequences, to review evidence about an idea or an event, to understand how descriptions and interpretations are created. They are constructed with sources, with evidence, not through WhatsApp universities, to analyze how societies have changed over time, to use primary and secondary sources to analyze interpretations of history, assess the merits of arguments, and look at how we can help students to develop ways of constructing historical arguments. The multi-choice questions of the CBSE does not allow us to do that. So there are questions on not only how it is taught, but how things are evaluated. In the NCF, the radical shift, as I said, was epistemological, because social sciences carried not only a normative responsibility of creating a strong sense of human values, freedom, trust, fraternity, mutual respect, etc., but the fact that there are distinctive methodologies and that we need to retain the boundaries of the discipline. Now, which means that there was a recognition that we need to integrate social sciences to enable engagement with all kinds of social issues, even economic, political issues, but that was seen as what was called social and political life. And yet, the disciplinary boundaries of history, of geography, of sociology, of political science were maintained, because it is the epistemological foundations of each discipline, history for example, that cannot be taught through integrative social science, and therefore this became a very important differentiation. The other thing, of course, we all know, instead of civics we looked at political science, and that's how the radical social sciences, social political life came into existence, which have been completely distorted today. But I must mention here that the very conceptualization and the treatment of social and political life textbooks we owe to Ekalavya, because that is where the real understanding of integration came, especially in the history and the civics books of Ekalavya Social Sciences. Professor Basant is going to talk about that perspective in greater detail with you. Are social sciences also about developing skills? That is something that we addressed in the book of Social Science Learning, which is essentially a review and an analysis and an understanding by various people who looked at the social science textbooks. And we found that yes, of course, if we are a science, we need to create the ability to interpret, combine source materials, to appreciate diverse interpretations, to assess causation and impact of historical change, to infer, to compare, to contrast, not to downplay the other, but to understand social phenomena. So critical pedagogy and curriculum and textbooks are very, very closely related. Often in the corridors of teacher education departments like my own, unfortunately, I have to be very candid in admitting that the old style B.Ed program would create a very deep divide between content and pedagogy. And this is not how we learn, this is not how we teach. And therefore, the agency of the child, the agency of the teacher and the textbook have to come together to be able to derive a pedagogic approach that creates what we now have been calling critical thinking, unfortunately a dirty word today. Nation states seek to define their sense of identity through textbooks. We know that. All governments all over the world try to do that. And these selective traditions actually claim to be legitimate knowledges, but they are not. So the cultural silences in a textbook is something that we need to be aware of. Just as there is exclusion, we also need to see what is included and why, and what is excluded and why, because each has its politics. And it's important to understand that the cultural and historical silences, what Michael Apple calls, is used as mentions in the textbooks, like limited, isolated elements of history and culture, which merely is tokenism. But who selects school textbook knowledge? What process is the textbook knowledge declared to be official knowledge? What voices are heard? Whose knowledge is included? Whose story is being told? Where are the marginalized groups? Are important questions for history, because history is not about chronology, as some people call it pastology, or some people, critical scholars have said that if there is no history teaching from the eye of the ordinary citizen, then it is called social amnesia, because Dewey also talks of history as a social study. The major debates on the inclusion of social sciences include integrated social sciences or social studies. I will just very briefly touch upon this distinct terminology that is used. Teaching of values, let's not forget 2000, when the NCF was saffronized and there was a court case and so on. At that time, NCRT established a special department called the Department of Values, because that was the idea, and of course citizenship education, etc. Now, while the integrated approach, there are plenty of child psychologists, plenty of developmental psychologists who will say that children do not see history as history, children do not see geography as geography, we need to integrate knowledge for them because that's the way they see the world. That's all very fine, that's all very rational. But that natural way of the child is probably not the way that we want to develop in the child. We will respect that way, and yet we will try and show them the interconnections between and interrelatedness of facets of society by giving them the rigorous tools and the epistemological approaches that history's uniqueness gives us, or that sociology's uniqueness gives us, or political science. So discipline focus is very important. Discipline focus is also important because we need to approach these subjects as independent disciplines, also because still today, and this was registered in the Aims of Social Science Teaching position paper of 2006 during the NCF, that social science is still seen as a non-utility subject. And the popular perceptions are very problematic, because the only good way in which we can teach history is to make tourist guides, and to sort of get some revenue generated out of young scholars of history who do that. China did that very well, actually. They created tourist guides in different languages, and actually they are making huge money on that basis. But that is no basis. That's a neoliberal idea of education. But we are talking of history teaching, which necessarily means that we need to challenge this economic, social, political model that gives wealth in concentrated ways to some and makes societies far more hierarchical and unequal power equations. So we need to look at these popular perceptions and redefine. I think it's important to reposition curricular knowledge, specifically when we saw in the 2000s of the neoliberal reforms that we were moving away, far away from the constitutional commitment of education towards equity and social justice. At least there was some lip service before that, but we moved very far away. And the more recent neoliberal policies we know have severed processes of teaching and learning from curricular concerns, and they are no longer central even to the policy discourse. We saw this in the COVID-19 pandemic that led to the closure of educational institutions, and we can't forget the structural problems of inequality that were laid bare on the streets when people were walking back home with their little children, and the middle class led state apathy towards injustices. Now the question therefore is, then when totalitarian ideas take over, then there is history that has to be the first to alter, to distort, to change, and create an acquiescent people. We need to envision a curriculum and pedagogy that is rooted in our constitutional values, and the epistemological and ontological questions that are central to addressing social inequality have to be brought back into curriculum, and history plays a very key role there. Again, reiterating that the anti-caste struggle discourse needs to be brought back into curriculum imagination. Tritya Ratna of Phule, Sharmila Rege's work we all know, but the anti-caste discourses were always left out, and 20th century anti-colonial movement never really gave any sort of priority to that. Now, as Rege says, there is also need to democratize the method of knowledge. And I think history plays a very critical role there, whether we talk of Swaraj as the liberation of self and the other, or we talk of Ambedkar, deeply influenced by Phule and by Dewey, underlining the idea of situated knowledge as critical to understand and transform the relationship between knowledge and power. And this can be done with history teaching, because history is both a method and a subject to engage with. The democratization of the method of knowledge seeks, according to Rege, the principles of prajna, which is critical understanding, karuna, which is empathic love, and samta, which is equality. And here I must say, conflict is the key for social transformation. Now, even books like Bipin Chandra's Modern India have been critiqued on this basis that they gloss over conflict. Now, it's true that young India was desperate to unify itself, and it's true that in the whole urge to do that, we were trying to gloss over conflicts and perhaps not bring them up front for discussion across the table in classrooms. But I think it's important when in 2005, when we had the RTI, before that, and RTE, I mean, all the rights fundamental rights were being shaped into acts. And I think that was an inflection point where we could see India evolving into a maturer democracy. And of course, we had a complete slide after that. But the question, therefore, is that the absence of conflict within curriculum, many scholars have said, is that it leads to political quiescence, that it fosters cognitive passivity, and that it suppresses history. And therefore, it's important to look at that as the center of social transformation if we want curriculum to play that role. And gender and caste, of course, we know how we need to bring in Dalit testimonies, etc., and a curriculum that enables dialogue. Because curriculum is not based on generic principles of essentialist knowledge. It is a deliberative exercise which evolves as society evolves. And it's important that we see curriculum as social dialogue, and that's where history becomes important as well. And in this flexibility, curriculum is allowed to become a tool of social dialogue and a means of adapting education systems to dynamic societies. So if culture is important to connect meaning with our people, culture also becomes a subject of interrogation and debate. And that is the reason why when NCF 2005 happened, there was a huge uproar from the left leaning community saying that local knowledge is not a great idea, Sati too is a local knowledge. And I think that was a very valid question which was addressed very well in the preamble of the NCF 2005 when Professor Yashpal, who wrote the preamble, said clearly that local knowledges have to align with the constitutional values. So though that is our litmus test, that doesn't mean that we throw away local knowledges or we throw away local histories, which are also important to engage students with. So bridging the ontological and the epistemological gap then becomes a very important aspect for us, and also problematizing the anthropocentric framing of curriculum. This is something that the 1975 curriculum also talks about. It talks of environmental stability way back in 1975, and it was Indira Gandhi, I mean there are lots of problems with Indira Gandhi, but it was Indira Gandhi who actually flagged to the world the importance of looking at poverty as an environmental concern. Not that poverty is simply an economic idea. And I think thereafter, Sen's work has been very, very important in helping us understand capability deprivation and how poverty needs to be seen in its social dimensions. So the struggle is also the struggle against epistemicides, as South Latin American scholars, Santos and others have talked about. What is the way ahead? The way ahead is the Constitution of India. I think it's the framing of the Constitution where the culmination of a more than century-long struggle can be seen. There were amendments made which also strengthened the document, and I think it's the Constitution that provides us the ontological and the epistemological foundations to transition from a deeply hierarchical, exclusionary, economic and social order to one that is sensitive not only to each other's rights and needs, but the planet and other species. And I think this is the way forward, because India's curricular documents for school and teacher education that came in NCF 2005 and 2009, along with the right of education, were that inflection point which were overturned after 2014, and we have regressed very deeply. So the question of what knowledge is most worth, I think, needs to be readdressed, and perhaps the answer lies in social sciences as the science that helps examine and understand complex social realities and develop rational thought and reasoning. And just the last, sharing with you a very interesting debate between different scientists, and these were largely physicists, and it happened in the journal Resurgence, and there were some editorials that were written, I mean op-ed articles that were written, and I must quote here Professor Natarajan Panchapakeshan from Delhi University Physics Department, now retired many years ago. He actually argues, and very interesting argument, that we develop rational thought through social science teaching, not through sciences. Because actually social sciences bring the conflicts in front of us, and they coerce us to reason, to understand the difference between opinion and fact, and of course social fact. I mean, the earth is round, well, we can debate it, but it's a fact. Social facts are more difficult and are important to debate. So real rationality emerges from social sciences. And the center of social sciences is to look at the past and to look at the present with that lens, not through the WhatsApp university, but through the classrooms and the debates and the discussions that students like you yearn for and take forward. Thank you very much for this opportunity.